Hey everyone, welcome back to Mental Wealth Reads. We're going to continue with chapter, what are we on? Chapter 8 of Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman. And it's going to be a quick one, I think, again today. It's about 10 pages, so it shouldn't take me very long to get through it. Yeah, it looks like we're going to keep talking about whatever it was. I can't remember what the last heading was. Oh, restoring control. We're gonna keep talking about that, and then we're gonna get into. I think the only other heading of this chapter is called completing the first stage. So we're going to we're gonna be wrapping up the first stage of recovery, which is great. So without further ado, we're gonna continue on. In the matter of criminal reporting, as in all matters, the choice must rest with the survivor. A decision to report ideally opens the door to social restitution. In reality, however, this decision engages the survivor with a legal system that may be indifferent or hostile to her. Even at best, the survivor has to expect a marked disparity between her own timetable of recovery and the timetable of the justice system. Her efforts to reestablish a sense of safety will mostly be undermined by the intrusions of legal proceedings. Just as her life is stabilizing, a court date is likely to revive intrusive traumatic symptoms. The decision to seek redress from the justice system, therefore, cannot be made lightly. The survivor must make an informed choice with the full knowledge of risks as well as benefits. Otherwise, she will simply be traumatized. With survivors of a single acute trauma, a rudimentary sense of safety can generally be restored within a matter of weeks if adequate social support is available. By the end of 3 months, stabilization in symptoms can usually be expected. Brief treatment that focuses on empowerment of the survivor can hasten the relief of symptoms. The process of establishing safety must be hampered or stymied altogether, however, if the survivor encounters a hostile or unprotective environment. The process may also be disrupted by intrusions outside the survivor's control, such as legal proceedings. It is nevertheless reasonable to expect that the therapeutic task of the first stage of recovery can be carried out within the general framework of crisis intervention or short-term psychotherapy. The standard treatment of acute trauma in combat veterans or rape survivors focuses almost entirely on crisis intervention. The military model of brief treatment and rapid return to normal functioning has dominated the therapeutic literature. One fairly typical military program is designed to return soldiers with combat stress reactions to active duty within 72 hours. In these cases, recovery is often assumed to be complete once the patient's most obvious acute symptoms have subsided. Crisis intervention, however, accomplishes the work of only the first stage of recovery. The tasks of the later stages require a more prolonged course of time. Though the survivor may make a rapid and dramatic return to the appearance of normal functioning, this symptomatic stabilization should not be mistaken for full recovery, for the integration of the trauma has not been accomplished. With survivors of prolonged repeated trauma, the initial stage of recovery may be protracted and difficult because of the degree to which the traumatized person has become a danger to herself. The sources of danger may include active self-harm, passive failures of self-protection, and pathological dependency on the abuser. In order to take charge of her own self-care, the survivor must painstakingly rebuild the ego functions that are most severely damaged in captivity. She must regain the ability to take initiative, carry out plans, and exercise independent judgment. Crisis intervention or brief therapy is rarely sufficient to establish safety. A longer course of psychotherapy is generally required. With survivors of chronic childhood abuse, establishing safety can become an extremely complex and time-consuming task. Self-care is almost always severely disrupted. Self-harming behavior may take numerous forms, including chronic suicidality, self-mutilation, eating disorders, substance abuse, impulsive risk-taking, and repetitive involvement in exploitative or dangerous relationships. Many self-destructive behaviors can be understood as symbolic or literal reenactments of the initial abuse. They serve the function of regulating intolerable feeling states in the absence of more adaptive self-soothing strategies. The capacities for self-care and self-loathing, which could not develop in the abusive childhood environment, must be painstakingly constructed in later life. Even the goal of establishing reliable self-care may initially be a point of contention between patient and therapist. The patient who is invested in a fantasy of rescue may resent having to do this work and may want the therapist to do it. The patient who is filled with self-loathing may not feel deserving of good treatment. In both instances, the therapist is often left with the feeling that she is more committed to ensuring the patient's safety than the patient herself. The psychiatrist John Gunderson, for example, describes the early phase of treatment with borderline patients as being focused on issues of the patient's safety and whose responsibility that will be. A long period of struggle over these issues can be expected. As in the case of a single acute trauma, establishing safety begins with control of the body and moves outward towards self-protection and the organization of a safe environment. Even the first order of business, control of the body, may be a complicated task because of the degree to which the survivor has come to view her body as belonging to others. In the case of Marilyn, a 27-year-old man who had been sexually abused by her father, establishing safety required an initial focus on the patient's care of her body. Marilyn sought psychotherapy as a last resort to deal with her severe chronic back pain. She thought that her pain might be related to stress, and she was willing to give psychotherapy a try. If she did not get quick relief, however, she planned to undergo extensive back surgery, which carried considerable risks of permanent disability. 2 prior surgeries had been unsuccessful. Her father, a physician, prescribed her pain medication and participated in the planning of her care. The surgeon was her father's close colleague. The therapy focused initially upon establishing Marilyn's sense of control over her body. The therapist strongly recommended that she postpone her final decision on surgery until she had fully explored all the options available to her. She also recommended that Marilyn keep a daily log of her activities, emotional states, and physical pain. It soon became apparent that her back pain was closely linked to emotional states. In fact, Marilyn discovered that she often engaged in activities that worsened the pain when she felt neglected or angry. Over the course of 6 months, Marilyn learned behavioral techniques of pain management and gradually formed a trusting relationship in psychotherapy. By the end of a year, her physical complaints had subsided. She was no longer taking medication prescribed by her father, and the possibility of surgery was no longer under consideration. She observed, however, that her back pain recurred during her therapist's vacation and during visits to her family home. In the process of establishing basic safety and self-care, the patient is called upon to plan and initiate action and to use her best judgment. As she begins to exercise these capacities, which have been systematically undermined by repeating abuse, she enhances her sense of competence, self-esteem, and freedom. Furthermore, she begins to develop some sense of trust in the therapist, based on the therapist's reliable commitment to the task of ensuring safety. When the survivor is not reliable about her own self-care, the question of involving supportive family members in her treatment often arises. Meeting with family members, lovers, or close friends may be useful. In this, as in all other matters, however, the survivor must be in control of the decision-making process. If this principle is not scrupulously observed, the survivor may come to feel belittled, patronized, or demeaned. She may also begin to feel that the therapist is allied with the members of her family rather than with her, and that they, not she, are responsible for her recovery. In the case of Florence, a 48-year-old married mother of 6 children, recovery progressed after the patient identified and reversed a pattern of relinquishing control to her husband. Florence had been in psychiatric treatment for 10 years, carrying diagnoses of major depression, panic disorder, and borderline personality disorder. Her history of extensive childhood abuse was known but had never been addressed in psychotherapy. When Florence had flashbacks or panic episodes, her husband usually telephoned her psychiatrist who would recommend a tranquilizer. Upon entering a group for incest survivors, Florence stated that she regarded her husband and her psychiatrist as her lifelines and felt she could not manage without them. She accepted their decisions about her care since she felt she was too sick to take an active part in her own treatment. Once she felt securely attached to the group, however, she began to express resentment against her husband for treating her like a baby. Group members pointed out that if she was capable of taking care of 6 children, she was probably far more competent than she realized. A turning point was reached when, during an upsetting episode at home, Florence refused to allow her husband to call the psychiatrist, stating that she could decide when such calls were necessary. The task of establishing safety is particularly complex when the patient is still involved in a relationship that has been abusive in the past. The potential for violence should always be considered, even if the patient initially insists that she is no longer afraid. It is common, for example, for a battered woman and her abuser to seek couple treatment shortly after a violent episode. Often the abuser has promised never to use force again and has agreed to seek counseling to prove his willingness to change. The abused woman is gratified by this promise and eager to enter treatment in order to save the relationship. For this reason, she often denies or minimizes the ongoing danger. Though both parties may wish for reconciliation, their unspoken goals are often sharply in conflict. The abuser usually wishes to reestablish his pattern of coercive control, while the victim wishes to resist it. Though the abuser is often sincere in his promise to give up the use of force, his promise is hedged with implicit conditions. In return for his pledge of nonviolence, he expects the victim to give up her autonomy. As long as the abuser has not relinquished his wish for dominance, the threat of violence is still present. The victim cannot possibly speak freely in couple sessions, and conflictual issues in the relationship cannot possibly be discussed without increasing the likelihood of a violent incident. For this reason, couples therapy is contraindicated until the violence has been brought under real control and the pattern of dominance and coercion has been broken. The guarantee of safety in a battering relationship can never be based upon a promise of the perpetrator, no matter how heartfelt. Rather, it must be based upon the self-protective capability of the victim. Until the victim has developed a detailed and realistic contingency plan and has demonstrated her ability to carry it out, she remains in danger of repeated abuse. Couples seeking help because of violence in their relationship should therefore be advised first to seek treatment separately. Wherever possible, the perpetrators should be referred to specialized programs for men who batter, so that not only the violence but also the underlying problem of coercive control will be addressed in treatment. In the case of Vera, a 24-year-old single mother of 3 children who was battered by her boyfriend, illustrates the gradual development of reliable self-protection during a year-long course of psychotherapy. Establishing safety required attention to Vera's care of her children as well as herself. The full range of therapeutic interventions was brought to bear in her treatment, including biological medication, cognitive and behavioral, education on traumatic syndromes, journal keeping and homework tasks, interpersonal, building a therapeutic alliance, and social, family support, and a protective court order. Vera obtained a court order banning her boyfriend from her home after he had beaten her in front of the children. Since his departure, she could not eat or sleep and found it difficult to get out of bed during the day. Nightmares and intrusive memories of violence alternated with fond memories of the good times during their relationship. She had frequent crying spells and thoughts of suicide. She sought therapy in order to get rid of him once and for all. On careful questioning, however, she acknowledged that she could not imagine life without him. In fact, she had already begun to see him again. She felt like a love addict. Though the therapist privately would have liked nothing better than to see Vera separate from her boyfriend, she did not agree to this as a therapeutic goal. She advised Vera not to set goals that seemed unattainable, since she had already had quite enough experiences of failure. Instead, she suggested that Vera postpone her final decision about the relationship until she felt strong enough to make a free choice and that in the meantime she focused on increasing her sense of safety and control of her life. It was agreed that during the initial phase of treatment, Vera would continue to see her boyfriend on occasion, but would not allow him to move back into her home and would not leave the children alone with him. These were promises she felt she could keep. At first, Vera was erratic about keeping appointments. The therapist was not critical, but pointed out the importance of her own self-respect of following through on plans she had made. Therapy settled into a fairly regular routine after it was agreed that Vera would only schedule appointments that she was sure she could keep. Each session focused on identifying some positive action, however small, that Vera felt she could take on her own behalf. Initially, she would rummage through her purse and find scraps of paper on which to write down this weekly homework. An important milestone was reached when she bought herself a notebook in which to record her weekly tasks and began to check off each accomplishment with a bright felt tip marker. One of Vera's chief complaints was depression. The only time she felt good were during brief romantic interludes with her boyfriend. Occasionally, he also supplied her with cocaine, which gave her a transient sense of power and well-being, followed by a crash that made her depression even worse. The therapist raised the possibility of a trial of medication for both depression and intrusive post-traumatic symptoms, but explained that she could not prescribe it unless Vera was willing to give up her recreational drug use. Vera chose to accept the medication and felt increased pride and self-confidence after refusing her boyfriend's offer of cocaine. She responded well to an antidepressant medication. As Vera's symptoms abated, the focus of treatment shifted to her children. Since the boyfriend's departure, the children, who used to be quiet and submissive, had gone completely out of control. She complained that they were clinging, demanding, and insolent. Overwhelmed and frustrated, she longed for her boyfriend to return so that he could knock some sense into them. The therapist offered information about the effects of violence on children and encouraged Vera to seek treatment for her children as well as for herself. She also reviewed practical options for help with childcare. The situation improved when Vera, who had been estranged from her family, invited a sister to visit for a few weeks. With her sister's help, she was able to reinstate predictable routines of childcare and non-violent discipline. The work of the therapy continued to focus on concrete goal setting. For example, one week Vera agreed to a goal of reading her children a bedtime story. This activity gradually developed into a soothing routine that both she and her children enjoyed, and she found that she no longer had to struggle to get her children to go to bed. Another milestone was reached when Vera's boyfriend called during one of these peaceful times and demanded to see her immediately. Vera refused to be interrupted. She told her boyfriend that she was tired of being available whenever he was in the mood to see her. In the future, he would have to make a date with her in advance. In her next therapy session, she reported with astonishment and some sadness that she no longer needed him so desperately. In fact, she really felt capable of getting along without him. Like battered women, adult survivors of chronic abuse in childhood are often still entangled in complicated relationships with their abusers. They may come into treatment because of ongoing conflict in these relationships and may wish to involve their families in the initial stages of their treatment. These encounters, too, should be postponed until secure self-protection has been established. Often some degree of coercive control is still present in the relationship between the perpetrator and the adult survivor, and occasionally the abuse itself is still recurring intermittently. The therapist should never assume that safety has already been established, but should carefully explore the particulars of the survivor's present family relationships. Patient and therapist together can then delineate problem areas in need of attention. Widening the survivor's sphere of autonomy and setting limits with the family of origin are the appropriate tasks during the initial stage of recovery. Disclosures to the family of origin and confrontations with the perpetrator are far more likely to be successful in the later stages. Securing a safe environment requires attention not only to the patient's psychological capacity to protect herself, but also to the realities of power in her social situation. Even when reliable self care is established, the patient may still lack a sufficiently safe environment to allow progression to the next stages of recovery, which involve in depth exploration of the traumatic events. The case of Carmen, a 21-year-old college student, illustrates how a premature family disclosure compromised safety. Carmen caused an uproar in her family by accusing her father, a wealthy and prominent businessman, of sexually abusing her. Her parents threatened to take her out of school and commit her to a psychiatric facility. She initially sought treatment in order to prove that she was not crazy and to avoid being literally imprisoned by her father. On evaluation, she was found to have many symptoms of a complex post-traumatic syndrome. However, she was not acutely suicidal, homicidal, or unable to care for herself, so there were no grounds for involuntary hospitalization. The therapist initially made clear that he believed Carmen's story. However, he also advised Carmen to consider the realities of power in her situation and to avoid a battle that she was not in a position to win. A compromise was reached. Carmen retracted her accusation and agreed to enter outpatient psychiatric treatment with the therapist of her choice. As soon as she recanted, her parents calmed down and agreed to allow her to continue school. Her father also agreed to pay for her treatment. In therapy, Carmen recovered more memories and became more certain that incest had in fact occurred. However, she felt obliged to keep silent out of fear that her father would cut off payments for therapy or school. She was accustomed to her family's affluent lifestyle and felt incapable of supporting herself. Thus, she felt entirely at her father's mercy. Finally, she realized that she was at an impasse. She could not progress any further with her treatment as long as her father retained financial control of her life. Therefore, after completing her junior year, she arranged a leave of absence from college, attained a job in an apartment, and negotiated a reduced fee for therapy based on her own income. This arrangement allowed her to progress in her recovery. In this case, creating a safe environment required the patient to make major changes in her life. It entailed difficult choices and sacrifices. This patient discovered, as many others have done, that she could not recover until she took charge of the material circumstances of her life. Without freedom, there can be no safety and no recovery. But freedom is often achieved at great cost. In order to gain their freedom, survivors may have to give up almost everything else. Battered women may lose their homes, their friends, and their livelihood. Survivors of childhood abuse may lose their families. Political refugees may lose their homes and their homeland. Rarely are the dimensions of this sacrifice fully recognized. Completing the first stage. Because the tasks of the first stage of recovery are arduous and demanding, patients and therapists alike frequently try to bypass them. It is often tempting to overlook the requirements of safety and to rush headlong into the later stages of the therapeutic work. Though the single most common therapeutic error is avoidance of the traumatic material, probably the second most common error is premature or precipitate engagement in exploratory work without sufficient attention to the tasks of establishing safety and securing a therapeutic alliance. Patients at times insist upon plunging into graphic, detailed descriptions of their traumatic experiences, in the belief that simply pouring out the story will solve all their problems. At the root of this belief is the fantasy of a violent cathartic cure which will get rid of the trauma once and for all. The patient may imagine a kind of sadomasochistic orgy, in which she will scream, cry, vomit, bleed, die, and be reborn, cleansed of the trauma. The therapist's role in this reenactment comes uncomfortably close to that of the perpetrator, for she is invited to rescue the patient by inflicting pain. The patient's desire for this kind of quick and magical cure is fueled by images of early cathartic treatments of traumatic syndromes, which by now pervade popular culture, as well as by the much older religious metaphor of exorcism. The case of Kevin, a 35-year-old divorced man with a long history of alcoholism, illustrates the error of premature uncovering work. Kevin stopped drinking after he nearly died from medical complications of his alcoholism. Newly sober, he began to be tormented by flashback memories of severe early childhood abuse. He sought psychotherapy to get to the bottom of his problem. He felt that the traumatic memories were the cause of his drinking and that he would never crave alcohol again if he just get it all out of my system. He refused to participate in a formal alcoholism program and was not attending Alcoholics Anonymous. He saw these programs as a crush for a weak-willed, dependent people and felt that he had no need for such support. The therapist agreed to focus on Kevin's childhood history. In the psychotherapy sessions, Kevin poured out his memories in gruesome detail. His nightmares and flashbacks worsened, and he began to make more and more emergency phone calls between sessions. In the meantime, his attendance at regular scheduled therapy sessions became erratic. During some of the phone calls, Kevin sounded drunk, but he adamantly denied that he had resumed drinking. The therapist realized her error only when Kevin arrived at session with alcohol on his breath. In this case, the therapist, who was unsophisticated in matters of substance abuse, paid insufficient attention to the task of establishing sobriety. She accepted the patient's argument that he had no need of social support, thus ignoring one of the basic components of safety. She also failed to recognize that exploring traumatic memories in depth was likely to stimulate more intrusive symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder and therefore jeopardize the patient's fragile sobriety. Kevin's case illustrates the need for a thorough evaluation of the patient's current situation before agreement is reached on the focus of psychotherapy. This evaluation includes an assessment of the degree of structure necessary to ensure safety. Outpatient psychotherapy may be inadequate or completely inappropriate for a patient whose self-care or self-protection is badly compromised. The patient may initially need day treatment, a halfway house, or referral to an alcohol or drug treatment program. Hospitalization may be required for detoxification, control of an eating disorder, or containment of suicidality. Necessary social interventions may include reporting children at risk to protective services, obtaining civil protection orders, or facilitating the patient's flight to a shelter. When the best course of action is unclear, the therapist is better off to err on the side of safety. By doing so, she puts the patient in a position to demonstrate that she is in fact capable of taking good care of herself and that the therapist is being overly cautious. If, on the contrary, the therapist minimizes the danger, the patient may be forced to demonstrate her lack of safety in a dramatic way. To counter the compelling fantasy of a fast, cathartic cure, the therapist may compare the recovery process to running a marathon. Survivors immediately grasp the complexities of this image. They recognize that recovery, like a marathon, is a test of endurance, requiring long preparation and repetitive practice. The metaphor of a marathon captures the strong behavioral focus on conditioning the body, as well as the psychological dimensions of determination and courage. While the image may lack a strong social dimension, it captures the survivor's initial feeling of isolation. It also offers an image of the therapist's role as a trainer and coach. While the therapist's technical expertise, judgment, and moral support are vital to the enterprise, in the end, it is the survivor who determines her recovery through her own actions. Patients often wonder how to judge their readiness to move on to the next stage of the work. No single dramatic event marks the completion of the first stage. The transition is gradual, occurring in fits and starts. Little by little, the traumatized person regains some rudimentary sense of safety, or at least predictability, in her life. She finds once again that she can count on herself and on others. Though she may be far more wary and less trusting than she was before the trauma, and though she may still avoid intimacy, she no longer feels completely vulnerable or isolated. She has some confidence in her ability to protect herself. She knows how to control her most disturbing symptoms, and she knows when she can whom she can rely on for support. The survivor of chronic trauma begins to believe not only that she can take good care of herself, but that she deserves no less. In her relationship with others, she has learned to be both appropriately trusting and self-protective. In her relationship with the therapist, she has arrived at a reasonably secure alliance that preserves both autonomy and connection. At this point, especially after a single acute trauma, the survivor may wish to put the experience out of mind for a while and get on with her life. She may succeed in doing so for a time. Nowhere is it written that the recovery process must follow a linear, uninterrupted sequence, but traumatic events ultimately refuse to be put away. At some point, the memory of the trauma is bound to return, demanding attention. Often the precipitant is a significant reminder of the trauma, an anniversary, for instance, or a change in the survivor's circumstances that bring her back to the unfinished work of integrating the traumatic experience. She is then ready to embark upon the second stage of recovery. Okay, that does it for chapter 8. And you know, the the end of chapter 8, or at least the first part of this video, was just a continuation of the section we had started last time. But I guess to reiterate, control is the most important thing. I know it says safety, but I'll get to that in a second. Control is the most important thing for somebody who has experienced some sort of trauma or abuse, or whatever it may be, whatever trauma they experienced. And I know I talked about this a bit last time, but the reason for that is simply because that control has been taken away from them, right? And it's basic control that's been taken away from them, right? I think I also mentioned Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If I didn't, I'll just do that real quick. There's essentially a triangle, and each layer of this triangle, each level of this triangle, is basically what we need to survive emotionally as a person, right? And at the very, very beginning is safety, right? The very bottom is safety. But there is it's going to be hard to establish safety without establishing some amount of control, right? Which is why I'm saying that control is the most important thing to reintroduce to this person's life. So in addition to reestablishing that sense of trust in the therapist's office, right? And in that sort of relationship, there needs to be trust, and the reason there needs to be trust is so that the client knows that they are safe, right? And there's something in this in their life that they can count on, which means that there's something in their life that they can control emotionally. And I don't mean that they can manipulate emotionally. I just mean that is control for them, right? That is something that they can manage emotionally, have some control over emotionally, right? And so this whole chapter, like I said, now and in the last video, is really about making sure you don't skip that step, right? Making sure you don't get too eager to help them, and even you as the client, right? Get too eager to get to that point where we're just getting into the nitty gritty of all the trauma experiences that you've had, that you forget to establish those areas of safety. As an example, I know they gave a couple here in the book, but as an example, I have clients who have come to me for various amounts of trauma, and we've talked about their trauma, we've talked about their experiences, but we've spent a lot more time with them on things that seem smaller in comparison, or less important in comparison, but they all have to do with do you still live in the environment that's traumatizing you, right? Do you still have relationships that resemble that traumatic relationship you had with whoever it was, right? Are you still doing things, or do you still have to do things, right? Are you still required to do things that put you at the same amount of risk as whatever your trauma was, right? If it's somebody in the military, right? Are you still in the military? Are you still deployable? Are you still somebody who is required to go into these danger zones, right? and essentially relive that whole emotional issue or situation, right? If you are somebody who are you or somebody who happens to have been abused, right? Either sexually or physically or emotionally or mentally or all the above, right? Are you still accessible to that person, right? That perpetrated you. Did you ever get any sense of closure for that, right? Are they still offending you or somebody else, right? Have they just not been brought to justice, or whatever the case may be? Is there still a chance that you might undergo this again? And even still, even if that's not the case, right? Are you in another relationship now that just resembles that because your brain's learned how to it's learned to equate that to safety, because you as much as as we've talked about in the past, right? You because the chaos of it was so constant that you learned to cling to that as something to rely on, right, in order to survive, right? And now you equate that as healthy, or you equate that as love, or whatever it might be, right? Whatever the case may be, are you safe now? And it's pretty typical that that there that question, the answer to that question is no. For people coming to you, or people who coming to therapy for trauma, and I don't necessarily mean that every person or the majority of people that come are still in that environment, or they're still there, even that there's any actually real risk of them experiencing all of this, but rather that there is still within them, and their nervous system, right, is still living or still functioning as if they are, right? And because of that, because their nervous system's still functioning the same way, they themselves are unknowingly doing certain things that are keeping the trauma unhealed, right, within them, right? And so that's what they're talking about when they're talking about completing the first step, right? They're talking about being able to spend some time with the maybe more obvious but often missed smaller things, that are right in front of you and the client, in terms of what's keeping this wound from being healed right now, right? And that's why this chapter goes as far as it does to just express that, like, that safety is important. That safety is paramount to even being able to get to talking about the trauma itself sometimes. As I mentioned, I've got clients who, have had years of abuse, and they're not necessarily being abused currently, but a lot of what we talk about is, how are you doing with your emotions, right? How is your environment lending to you being able to feel all of your emotions in a safe space? And if you don't have that right now, it's not that we can't talk about your trauma, but we can open this up, open all of your trauma up and talk about it in session, and, really bring it to the forefront, and ultimately do more damage, because now you're going back to an environment that's not allowing you or your body to feel all that it needs to feel in order to process it out, right? And so all I'm doing here, by asking you to talk about it here with me and then go home, right, is I'm just bringing it now to a place where you can't ignore it, and sending you out into an environment where you're not going to be able to process it in a healthy way. So I'm ultimately re-traumatizing you without maybe even wanting to, obviously, but that's the kind of thing that we have to think about whenever this sort of thing is happening. And I think one important thing, and I think they mentioned it briefly in this chapter, but one important thing really is that you're going to want to help. If you're a therapist watching this and you're trying to get some insight from this, it's not a bad thing that that you might find yourself being really eager to help this person, and let's talk about this, right? Let's unpack this. Let's get this out of the way, right? um, it's really easy to fall into that, actually, because it comes from a good place, right? We're trained to be caring. We're trained to be eager to learn about our clients and help them really unpack things and sort them out and get rid of them, right? Um, but like this book says, it's pretty easy to get caught in that trap in terms of with most other diagnoses, like, yeah, talking about it is good. With anxiety, talking about it is good. Even trauma, like, of course, talking about it is good. But there's a lot of emotional complexity with trauma that has to be guarded, and it can be easy to assume that, like, trauma is, of course, like a one size fits all kind of thing, where, if it's good to talk about other emotions, it's good to talk about this without having to set up those steps and having to get establish that safety first, right? So, basically, before I keep rambling about this, your most important step is to establish that safety and control, right? Um, and if that means that you're gonna spend months and months and months not even talking about the trauma, but talking about, hey, like, were you able to start going to the gym? Were you able to start doing, the homework I've been assigning you? Like, were you able to accomplish, little goals, right? Little things here and there. Were you able to do that? And if not, how come? Let's figure that out. Let's see what's getting in the way, of you being able to be able to cross off these accomplishments and feel good about yourself and feel that control, right? But two, you may spend a lot of time in this space where you're also just trying to, like, you're working with the client to make the space safe, like we've talked about before, right? You may spend a lot of time with that, and that's okay. That doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. That doesn't mean you're going slow. That doesn't mean you are incompetent. It simply means that you're taking your time where you need to be. And if you're a client hearing this, or you're somebody who is interested in getting therapy for trauma, and you're listening to this, know that you may be in that situation. It may feel like your therapist is not going fast, right? Because you're probably going to be itching to get that all out. What you need to know going into this experience is, it's ultimately going to be up to you, right? It's going to be up to you to establish the pace, right? If your therapist is there, seemingly like sitting on their hands and just, trying to get through a session, and not really talking about anything of depth, or that anything that feels like it has any depth to you, that's a really good time to ask your therapist about that, because it's very likely that this is what they're doing, right? It's very likely that they are trying to mind your pace, and not rush into it because they don't want to re-traumatize you. They want to make sure that you feel safe and you trust them. And if the fact that they're going slow is something that is keeping you from trusting them, that's a good thing to tell them. It's something I tell people a lot, and I'm sure I've said it a bunch in these videos, but we can't read your mind, right? And I say that softly, gently. I don't say that, with any sort of salt. We're not trained to read your mind, right? So there's going to be a time where you're going to get to a point where your therapist, it seems like they're not doing what you want them to do, right? But there is no reason that you can't ask them or tell them what you want, right? They're not going to fire you for telling them what you want. In fact, they're going to appreciate it a lot. At least I know I would. I know that if you were my client and you came to me and you were like, "Hey, Alicia, like, we've been spending a lot of time in this area, and I'm really frustrated by that because it feels like we're not dealing with anything," right? I would respect the hell out of that, and I would appreciate that. And that would then open up a conversation between me and you about, okay, like, I apologize for not knowing that that's how you were feeling. Um, how would you like to go forward? Like, let's sit down and let's plan this out, right? So that I know what kind of a pace. And then no matter what you choose, right? If it turns out that that pace was too fast or that pace was too slow, even, you're allowed to change your mind, right? You're allowed to tell me, hey, Leash, I'm sorry. Like, I I thought I wanted to go faster, but it really turns out that that was a better speed. Can we go back to that? Sure, right? That's a huge thing, right? And I want to call this out too, as I'm saying that, right? You may have the kind of trauma that makes that a hard conversation to have with somebody, right? We're talking about having control taken away from you. That may be a hard thing for you to say up front. Um, know that your therapist is going to be compassionate about that. Um, the average therapist that I know, and have met, um, uh, even just speaking for myself, right? Like, I'm not going to be bitter or upset about um, you trying to help me know what you need, right? I'm not going to yell at you for telling me I'm doing things wrong. I'm not going to fire you for telling me I'm doing things wrong. I'm going to welcome it, basically, because at the end of the day, like, what you need is important, right? If I'm going to try to be establishing this sense of safety for you and trust within our relationship, but I don't know what that means to you, and my questions don't seem to be getting me to an answer um, that works, um, then your input's going to be really helpful for me. And again, um, if you don't know all of that walking in, that's also okay, right? We don't expect people to come in having, the amount of emotional intelligence to be their own therapist by the time they come, when they come to us for the first time. Um, Most of what I do for all of my clients is that emotional intelligence training, right? Like, basically teaching you how to ask yourself the questions I'm going to ask you when you walk in, so that at some point you don't need me as much, right? Um, and uh, so know that you are much more in control of how this goes, how it goes in session with me or whoever your therapist is, than you might think you have, or than you might think you are, right? Um, because at the end of the day, um, we're trying to help you heal for you, right? Um, I, I in my line of work, what I do is I help you get better, right? And as I've said, there's sometimes I can't help you get better if I don't know what's going on inside you, and I'm gonna do my best. I'm gonna do my best um, to ask you all the right questions and have the right kind of conversations to help you feel like you are healing and this is good, and that you have control over that, and things like that. Um, but I will not always know. Your therapist will not always know, and I think it's really understandable if you forget that, right? It's really understandable if you're in the throes of your own emotions and you forget that I'm not perfect either. That's okay. That's okay. I don't bring any of these things up to tell you as a client or you as a therapist that everyone in the situation has to be emotionally and mentally perfect every single time. That's not reasonable. You can't expect that from anybody. Um, you know, um, I simply bring this up just so there's an awareness, right? I bring this up so that it's something that if you are considering therapy or in therapy, right? Just as a background, and if you're a therapist, hopefully this is giving you some more insight, on any clients that you're working with, that you may be struggling with and not knowing if you're doing the right thing or going the right pace or whatever, right? Um, Generally speaking, like I said, it's important that in the beginning, as it is at any stage, really, that there is a working alliance between the two of you, right? There needs to be at least a relationship where you as the client trusts me as the therapist to help you heal, right? And that may come hard for you. That may um, not come as easy for you as the client, and it may not come easy as a therapist either. There we've talked about transference and countertransference. There's some things in that realm, that may come as a reminder of things that you've been through as a therapist. What's most important here, right, is at the end of the day, we return to a sort of state of grace within ourselves, right? We return to this place where we're able to say, you know what, I am human. I am human. I cannot be expected to be everything for everyone. I will try my best to be good. I will try my best to be helpful. I will try my best to be compassionate. I will try my best to be empathic or empathetic. I don't know how you say that actually correctly, but I will try my best to be good to people, right? Um, and and that's the best we can do, you know. I'm going to be going on a little bit of a soapbox, so I'm going to stop myself there. But point of this, end of chapter 8, it's important to feel safe before you move through to any of the deeper levels of recovering from trauma. That's basically it. I'm going to leave you guys with that. And again, if you have any questions about anything I said today, or want me to go any further in depth with anything that I've said here or any of the past videos, please feel free to reach out to me. As I always say, check out the website, mentalwealthtoday.org. There's a lot more content there. There's even merch. There's a blog that I sometimes add to. There's a podcast there too. And there are other services too that I do that you're welcome to take a look at or recommend to other people. It is what it is. But anyway, reach out to me. Feel free to reach out to me as always. Let me know if there's any other books you want me to look into, or any subjects you want me to read about. Or if you have any ideas for a class that you want me to build, I'd be happy to take recommendations there as well. But otherwise, I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks as always for listening. Bye.